Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk About It. This is Susan Johnson, and my co-host isn't with me right now, but who knows? He may show up anytime. But in the meantime, I have two wonderful guests who have been working diligently at the Capitol to help us make sure that our state employees and people who are unionized are getting the kinds of benefits that they're supposed to get to try and keep up with what's going on in our society these days. So first of all, I just want to say hi to Brian Anderson, who is a legislative political director for AFSCME. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thanks, Susan. It's a pleasure.
It's great to have you here. Tell us a little bit about the oversight of the work that you're doing with AFSCME.
Well, as legislative director at Council for AFSCME, Susan, I represent 30,000 public employees, about half of them state employees, half municipal. So, for instance, we represent the Wyndham Town Hall employees, Coventry Town Hall public works employees, but we also represent all the DOC, Department of Correction workers, DCF workers, DSS workers, and about 2,000 municipal police officers.
Well, that's a lot of work there, Brian, and I thank you for the good work and keeping people organized. That's wonderful. We'll get into some of the details of those different groups in a minute, but I also want to say how happy I am that we have Jennifer Berigan here, who is the director of the Connecticut AFL-CIO, and she also has been working on all kinds of contracts to help our state employees. Welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit about the people that the different groups that you represent.
Well, as a legislative director of the Connecticut AFL-CIO, I work with Brian at the state capitol and a bunch of other labor union lobbyists, and the Connecticut AFL-CIO is a federation of hundreds of local unions throughout the state of Connecticut, representing almost 250,000 active and retired workers and their family members in the private sector, the public sector, and the building trades. So we represent the municipal employees in Brian's union, for example, at Board of Ed and town halls across the state. We represent private sector workers like nurses and other healthcare workers in the healthcare sector. We represent machinists at Pratt and Electric Boat. In Sikorsky, we represent folks building schools and renovating schools and doing major economic development construction projects across the state. So, in state employees, we cover the gamut, and we do what we can to, first and foremost, protect their rights in the workplace, but also advance legislation that will make their lives a bit easier.
Oh, that's great. And so thank you both for being here. And, of course, we were just talking about the CBAC agreement, state employees agreement that had been worked on for the last 3 years, and making some adjustments to it and keeping it consistent with what our plans are, is to continue the budget that we put forth last year. But we have ways of addressing certain aspects of it that I found to be very, very good, and I'm glad to see us taking the initiative in the legislature to move forward with some of these bills. So, Brian, did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, Susan, it was really good to see the Appropriations Committee of the state legislature vote through a positive recommendation for the CBAC agreement. Like you said, this is the fourth year of a 4-year agreement. It's a 2.5% wage increase with one step. So that is right in line with what the private sector is getting at about a 4.5% increase for our workers, whereas it's 4.6% for private sector workers.
Right. And so, and Jennifer, I know you were there as well. You want to tell us a little bit about your take on today's activities?
Well, yeah, thank you. Again, we're really pleased with the work that the Appropriations Committee did today in supporting these very dedicated public servants and the work that they do to provide vital public services to the taxpayers in the state of Connecticut. And Brian kind of touched on it, but this wage reopener that the State Employees Bargaining Agent Coalition was able to negotiate on behalf of state employees gives them a much-deserved raise that helps keep pace with the cost of living in the state and helps keep pace with the private sector, because what we're seeing is that private sector wage growth is far exceeding public sector wage growth. And what that means for taxpayers in the state is that we have fewer public employees who are staying around and building a career in the public sector. And that's very concerning when we're talking about, DCF investigations or health and safety investigations in workplaces and other important functions that the government provides. So making sure that workers can earn a fair living and have good paying wages and benefits that sustain them and encourage them to have a long career in public service is important for all of us.
Well, as you know, I sit on the Appropriations Committee, and the hearings that we have from almost the very beginning of February all the way through to now have been from people all over the state. Healthcare workers, workers at the universities, workers all throughout, calling to say and coming in and providing testimony about the fact that we are losing state workers. We don't have enough. We don't have enough local workers to help us with education. We don't have enough workers in our hospitals. We don't have enough workers to address the needs and the teaching requirements in our university systems. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that we haven't even indexed the cost of the employees in these different positions, whether it is indexing Medicaid reimbursements for the healthcare professionals or indexing how we deal with our education, special education issues. So we haven't really been indexing that, and I think that's a big mistake. Do you want to handle any of that, Jennifer?
Sure, I agree with you. I mean, when you think about the cost of living in terms of how a family addresses it and how it impacts a family's budget, it's no different when you kind of take it up a few levels and we're talking about municipal or state government. And so when we don't keep pace with the things that fund these public services, it is the taxpayers who ultimately suffer because they can't access those services when they need them. And so, and it's things that maybe don't occur to all of us at first, but like you brought up Medicaid, right? And so when we don't have, or when our Medicaid reimbursement rates are so low that it's not affordable for healthcare facilities to treat Medicaid patients, that has an impact on all of us, and we're all going to pay for that in terms of uncompensated care if we don't do that. So I agree with you. We've got some work to do, and there's been an effort, right, post-pandemic to try to address some of these issues with one-time federal ARPA dollars, but they're one-time dollars. And so now we've got to really do some of the work, dig in, and really invest in these kinds of things where we've plugged holes with temporary funds. We've got to really allocate state resources to these things that are important to all of us.
Exactly. Brian, do you want to talk a little bit more about the fact we haven't been indexing the actual cost for the workers, whether it's in the state reimbursements for the towns so that the people who are unionized workers in the town, or whether it's corrections officers and officials, these things haven't been indexed either.
You're right, Susan. And there's sort of a myth of the overpaid public employee, and it's a very unfortunate myth. I'll give you an example. Our corrections officers over about the last 25 years have taken 10 years of hard zeros, meaning no COLA increase and no step increase. And a step increase is sort of a payment for being on the job a long state and municipal level to do a lot better. We also have a very uneven situation for municipal employees. If a municipal employee works for a wealthy town, he or she has a much better chance of getting a pay raise. If they work for a financially challenged town, sort of like the city of Hartford or Bridgeport, they have a much more difficult road to staying, even with the cost of living, with escalating inflation. I'd be all for indexing if we could figure out a way to do it.
Yes, so you raise an interesting thing. Also, you have to include Wyndham in the municipalities that are financially strapped. And one of the reasons municipalities like Hartford, Bridgeport, Waterbury, Wyndham, New Haven, New London, all these places, Norwich, they are strapped because they provide services to the region and to the state. And they don't have the taxable property that the wealthy districts have. So while we're talking about that, I always refer to the municipalities that are having a struggle as the serving towns, because they serve the state. Mm-hmm. They serve the region. They make sure that there's a homeless shelter for some people who don't have any homes because the state hasn't been very good at developing housing. And it's been very bad at providing a social safety net for people who run into hard times. And then what happens to the students in the schools that end up in the homeless shelters, if they're lucky, because we don't even have enough shelter space in our homeless shelters for families, is they get traumatized by the fact that they don't have a place to live. And then we need them to go into special education. And those will be the towns, again, that serve the region, that serve the people who don't have. And primarily because the state hasn't done a very good job of making sure that we provide for our people in the state. And many of these people who are homeless, by the way, are working. They're working. They're working in jobs that aren't unionized. They're working in areas where they may, be on and off type of retail workers or something like that. And they're not making the kind of money that will be able to, where they will be able to afford to pay for the rent and the food that they need to support the family. So I just wanted to be clear about how uneven our towns are and how people misunderstand the fact that the towns that serve are the towns that have the least amount of resources and need to be able to index also the amount of funding that goes for the payment in lieu of taxes to those towns because they suffer because they serve, and also for the actual education cost-sharing grant, which I'm pleased to say we're almost there in terms of making sure the underfunded towns are finally going to be up to date with the towns that are more wealthy. And so there's that. But we still have a long way to go because we're not fully funding special education, which is another issue altogether. But it does fit in with the fact of what you're doing, Brian, and that is to make sure that municipal employees are paid appropriately.
Yes, Susan, it really is a challenge. One of the problems unique to Connecticut is Connecticut cities never grew out of their 1700s boundaries. So the cities are have minimal representation up at the state capitol. For instance, 43% of the whole New York State legislature is from New York City. 11% of the whole Massachusetts legislature is from one city, Boston. Providence, 16%. And then you get to Connecticut. Connecticut's three biggest cities, Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport, control only 11% of the state legislative seats. That makes this a very strong suburban state and a very weak state for city representation. And unfortunately, the suburban legislators have not been sympathetic to the cities. And that's resulted in a terrible problem, like you say, the cities being underfunded. Like you say, the hospitals, the colleges, things that take up a lot of space and pay minimal or no property tax, take of most cities' taxable area, whereas in the suburbs, their entire area is quite often taxable, and that becomes a giant property tax problem for municipalities like Wyndham.
Yes. Thank you for that. And that is, go ahead, Jennifer.
No, I think that's important, and it also there's another facet to that issue, right? And that's the inequality between the suburban towns and the more rural communities and urban communities, right?
Right.
And so not only does that create, stagnation, wage stagnation, which contributes to kind of, depression-like circumstances for those who are not earning a living wage or have good benefits, but it also creates inequality between our cities and towns and suburbs and rural communities. And so there was a study that this Washington, D.C. based think tank did a few weeks ago. It got some press in Connecticut. It's New America is the name of the study of the think tank. And they analyzed thousands of adjacent school systems across the country, comparing the median household income of one district against another to measure educational disparities. And it found that of the top 300 disparities in the country, 23 of them were in Connecticut, and meaning that you had districts with very low median incomes next to districts with very high median income, and then you had those high median income districts were very high performing school districts, and you're not surprised to know that the ones with lower median incomes were not as well performing. And this goes back to, like Brian was saying, you have this tenet in Connecticut, right, that home rule is best. And maybe for some things that's best, but when we're talking about education and other important public services, sometimes that doesn't always work out in students' favor in this case. And so when you have those kinds of levels of disparity and inequality between communities, it's those communities with low median incomes, when we don't index wages, when we don't index the revenues to those communities, then you create the system of generational poverty. Then it's almost impossible to try to lift people out of poverty and give them fund the opportunities that give them bridges to careers and lifestyles where they can not just survive but thrive. And Senator Fonfara in the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee has a really interesting bill that came out of the committee, Senate Bill 456, and he takes a look at concentrated poverty and requires the state to develop 10-year plans to attack concentrated poverty and in communities, in particular census tracts, where those levels are the greatest. In cooperation with the Department of Economic and Community Development, he would create a community engagement and neighborhood investment office. So if we don't take care of these things on the front end, we're going to have prescriptions like the one Senator Fonfara has offered to address the impacts.
Exactly. I co-sponsored Senate Bill 456 because I thought, wow, this is exactly what we need. And it's also in line with some of the legislation I've proposed in the past to, say, for example, take the payment in lieu of taxes statute and add every single piece of property that isn't in the payment in lieu of taxes statute and add it to the statute. And that would mean for my district, at least $6 million that isn't being paid for at all under pilot would have some money coming in under the pilot program. And we're a Category 1, because I'm sure y'all remember when Senator Looney proposed that legislation creating a 3-tiered payment in lieu of taxes system, the towns like ours that are low income, that have a huge amount of state property and a huge amount of non-taxable property in it, that we would be put into one category category, and then the towns with fewer amounts of state properties or non-taxable properties would be category 2 and 3. And so with that, we were able to have some more resources. But having a 10-year study and develop a plan to eliminate concentrations of poverty is exactly where we need to go. And we're going to stop here for a couple minutes because we've got our sponsors going to help us pay for this show. And we'll be right back, ladies and gentlemen, after these messages. Hey, welcome back, everyone. This is Susan Johnson, and I'm here with our two wonderful guests, Brian Anderson, who is the Legislative Political Director of AFSCME, and Jennifer Berigan, who is the Director of the Connecticut AFL-CIO. And I'm so pleased to have these very knowledgeable people here on the show because they're telling us a lot about what's going on in the state of Connecticut and why we're where we are. And so we were just talking about how, and I like what you just finished saying, Brian, about how places like Wyndham have been serving the country since the Civil War.
Exactly, Susan. Like I was saying, Wyndham clothed every United States Army that went into battle between the Civil War and Vietnam. Wyndham's contribution to this country in terms of manufacturing, in terms of just being patriotic and having citizens serve in the military, it's been immense. And it's a shame when Wyndham can use help after losing manufacturing, as you cited, that help is not being repaid. And that is just a shame. We should all be united as a country. We should all look out for each other. And it's a shame when sometimes you have suburban state legislators looking down their nose at cities.
Exactly the problem, and not understanding the amount of work that we do to support the regions and support the state, and then having them just think that we're getting too much money for our students when we have more students than they do. Mm-hmm. And some of them have classrooms as small as 10 per classroom, whereas in our urban areas we're up to 30. And then just think about the teachers, and maybe they don't even have a paraprofessional in their particular classroom, yet they have to be able to maintain all the special education requirements of each individual student, which I can't even imagine how you do that in a classroom.
You don't. And I'm glad you brought up paraeducators, Susan, because this is a crisis in our state, and I'm just amazed that we haven't seen a class action lawsuit yet on behalf of special education students who are not getting their needs met, special education students usually have individualized education plans, IEPs, that are developed to meet their needs, and they're learning what they need to learn. And we have over 1,300 vacancies for paraeducators across the state because they don't make a living wage. A lot of them don't have affordable health care. Very few of them have access to any kind of retirement. They make just above minimum wage in most districts. I don't know of a district that pays a starting wage to a paraeducator that's over $20 an hour. And so they've got to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. They're 10-month employees. They don't get unemployment during the summer. They do it because they love the work. They love the kids that they work with. They love what they do, and they're so good at it. But they are not rewarded in terms of pay or benefits. And since the pandemic, when so many kids are trying to kind of recoup learning loss that they've learned, and mental health has become a huge issue where we have more mental health or more recognized mental health needs maybe than we did before the pandemic. And with these shortages and these extra challenges, it's becoming violent in some of these classrooms where students are lashing out, they're frustrated, they're not learning. And then we don't have the sufficient staff levels that we need. It's becoming dangerous for paraeducators on top of all the other challenges
I'm really
that they face.
Glad you mentioned the violence in some of these schools, because Senator Flexer and I put together a bill, Senate Bill 50, which actually took into consideration the fact that we need to have more flexibility in the guardrails, the so-called guardrails, which includes the spending cap, the revenue cap, the bonding cap, and the volatility cap. And while neither one of us or any of us want to see the guardrails go away, we want to see flexibility. And one of the things that we got were students from New London came in on their own. A nice high school class came in, and they testified on our Senate Bill 50. And they did an excellent job. And they said that before the money came in that was for the COVID money, they had kids knocking other kids off a chair to take the chair to eat their lunch, stuff like that. And they said when they brought in trainers on how to interact, how to behave in a school, how to do the things that they needed to do, get the therapy they needed for whatever problems they had with interaction, that the school now is great. And now that they're having the chance to learn, and they were all so great and articulate, speaking about all the different things that they were able to have, and they don't want to see that go away. Yet, because of the spending cap and the guardrails, we won't be able to fully fund these programs after this cycle. So right now we're maintaining everything that we agreed to for the budget for this biennium. But as we move forward, we're going to have to take a look at how we're going to be able to fund these kinds of programs in the future so our students can come out of school functioning either with post-secondary education opportunities or going right into jobs that they have and that we're able to provide them with, going right into, say, a place like Electric Boat, Pratt & Whitney, or Sikorsky Aircraft. All these places start the students off at a very high rate, and they're able to get a good education and a good job, and maybe they go back to school when they have enough money to pay for more. And but we also are providing a free community college. We want to be able to continue to do that because we need to be able to invest in our students and invest in the kids and the people in the state of Connecticut.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the example you cite about the kids from New London tells us, reinforces, I think, what we already know. You might not hear that in a well-funded suburban district, but in an urban district like New London that isn't well-funded, doesn't have the tax base, isn't getting the level of support that they need from the state, that just tells us what money can do in a classroom setting. And it's like tying the hands of teachers and other education professionals, tying their hands behind their backs because they don't have the resources to deliver the kinds of supports and education that we all know kids need. And that's why these fiscal guardrails are choking our communities, right? It's good that we have some fiscal restraint and we've been able to pay down pension debt and other debt. That's important, but we don't just have one fiscal control, one fiscal guardrail. We have several, and they're kind of layered on top of each other. And we have a rainy day fund that's over $3.5 billion that we haven't touched since 2017. But meanwhile, there are great needs in many communities across the state, not just education. Our community colleges and our public institutions of higher education are suffering deficits. We talked about Medicaid, early childhood. It's very difficult to find affordable child care in the state for a lot of working parents, and they can't go to work if they don't have child care that is that they can trust and that they can afford to take good care of their kids while they go out and earn a living. So there are lots of areas where we need investment in this state, where that if we do invest will yield great returns for the state, but we're just hampered by those fiscal guardrails right now.
And it's not like we would use a lot of that money. We would definitely keep that rainy day fund there, but to be able to, get the revenue cap and the spending cap are actually caps that should have more flexibility in them. And there are caps, whereas the volatility cap, that's where you can pay more debt. And now that we have a full funded rainy day fund, it would just be to pay some of the debt, and which it does give more room in the appropriations budget for spending. But it's nowhere near enough to address where we are right now because we failed to index the Medicaid cost. We failed to index the costs of our employees on the municipal and state level. To think that I heard Senator Austin talk about when she was a prison official, she actually said she had 10 years with no increase in her salary back then. And that's not right. I mean, to think that you would have 10 years without an increase at all in your salary. And that's something that when you take a look at the prison officials, they are, they are doing amazing work, dangerous work sometimes, and it's something that doesn't get a lot of discussion. And so, Brian, I know that you've been looking at that, and one of the things I hope for that we can take a look at for next session is to make sure there's enough people getting paid enough of a wage for behavioral health help and providing better conditions in prisons.
Exactly, Susan. Mental health is a big challenge in prisons. Our staff spend a lot of their time stopping the few predatory inmates from picking on inmates who aren't able to defend themselves. And mental health definitely plays into that in facilities like Garner and across the whole system. There's been a real increase in assaults on staff and inmate assaults. And I know you've tried to get more manning, more posts in the state budget so that we have enough corrections officers, counselors, and then on the medical side, enough medical practitioners to make the facilities safe. The population in prisons arguably is the sickest population, both physically and from a mental health perspective in the state. So your work on that's very much appreciated.
Thank you for that. And, that is something that, this is something that we should all be focused on because when people are discharged from prison, they come back into the community. And we want to make sure they come back in the communities where they function, where they're able to get a job, where they're able to do the things that we want to have them do when they become integrated into the community. And if they haven't gotten the right care, then they're not going to have the wherewithal, because it's got to be very disorienting to begin with, to leave, being out in the community and then leave and go to prison and then come back out into the community. Unless you have some kind of support and putting people back in the community in homeless shelters or on the street or on the riverbank here, this is not the way to fully integrate people into the community. So we've got to do better in that area, and we have to really fully understand what we're doing. And I don't think that just discharging people without the right behavioral health support, without the right educational support. I mean, we have now a bill right now that we should be able to get more educational support for people in prison, so when they come out, they'll have a start at doing some work and getting something done.
Yeah, and the building trades have been doing a lot of work in this area, too, to develop pre-apprenticeship programs for inmates that are going to be released, within a certain period of time, and working to develop those initial skills, trade skills that they can then, when they're released, go into an apprenticeship and develop the skills they need to build a career in the trade. So as an electrical worker, a plumber, a pipe fitter, a welder, whatever it is that is of interest to them, so they can, have a family-sustaining job and health care and access to retirement once they're released, and once they've paid their debt to society and they're released, and they can begin, the next phase of their life.
Go ahead. That's so important. I just want to say, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it is. But then we've got to make sure, right, that like you're talking about indexing payments to different programs, we have to make sure that those wages keep pace with inflation, right? And that workers can continue to negotiate in a union fair wages and benefits. Because we were talking about corporations during the break. Corporate profits since 2021 have grown 35%.
Yep.
Just in 3 years, really. Think about that. That's a lot.
I've been thinking about it.
I know you have. And then, in 1965, CEOs earned just 21 times that of a typical worker.
Yep.
And today, that number is 334 times.
It's stunning, isn't it?
Typical worker. It's absolutely stunning.
It's like that. It's like that saying that they say, the more billionaires you have, the more poor people you have, right? I think it's
well, yeah, that's income inequality in a nutshell, right?
Yes, it is.
And when the decks are stacked against them, it's almost impossible for workers to have a fair shot. And so that's why the Connecticut AFL-CIO has been working to pass legislation to help striking workers. Because when you're going to negotiate a contract, it's not a level playing field.
No.
The employer really holds all the cards, and the employer can kind of force a strike by making a last best offer that they know that the employees can't afford to accept, and they'll have no choice but to go on strike. But then there's no mechanism to bring the employer back to the bargaining table.
Exactly.
So we have legislation pending that would allow striking workers to access unemployment benefits after they've been on strike for 2 weeks. The point is not to pay out benefits to the workers. The point is to incentivize the employer to keep bargaining and to bargain in good faith.
Exactly. I co-sponsored that legislation, and I do appreciate that proposal, and I think that will put the pressure because they have to pay a certain amount. The employers have to pay a certain amount in the unemployment compensation, and so this may help push them into making an agreement and not just have the push on the employee side, but push on both sides because you need to have a balanced, negotiation system. And you know what? We are running out of time here. I have to say thank you so much to Brian Anderson and thank you so much to Jennifer Berigan for this fabulous conversation, really in-depth chat about what's going on and how our state works. So I can't thank you enough. And a couple of seconds from each of you just to say whatever you want to say to finish up with.
Oh, I just want to thank you for inviting me to be here with you this evening. It's a real pleasure, and it's a real pleasure to work with you at the state capitol on these issues that we talked about tonight. Thank you for the work that you do.
Well, thank you for your work. And Brian?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks to Jennifer and thanks to you because both of you have fought really hard to help out working people and to stop it from being a state where people can work full-time and still be poor. And Jennifer has done a great job of trying to make sure every worker in Connecticut has a decent pay, pension, and health care, both unionized workers and those who aren't lucky enough to have a union. So it's great to work with you both.
Well, thank you. I agree. Working with both of you is great as well. Thank you so much for being on. Let's talk about it. Tune in next week, everyone, for another great show. Take care and have a great weekend.